and we're going to continue along this painful pathway and studying the pain pathways and nicotine and tobacco use. So now it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Joseph Ditre from Syracuse University to talk about reciprocal model of pain and nicotine and tobacco use, emerging research, and future directions. Ciao.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Very thankful to have been invited here and to speak with all of you about this topic. I'm also really glad that we had the presentations that came before mine. They did a really wonderful job of outlining some of the neurobiological mechanisms that are involved in these relationships, as well as some of the animal work, which has been hugely influential in the things that I've been focusing on and others in the human literature. So this will focus more on some of the behavioral aspects of chronic pain and addiction, specifically focused on tobacco use. So, like smoking, chronic pain is a critical national health problem that motivates 50 to 80% of all physician visits and is associated with significant health care and lost productivity costs. Recently, we reviewed the literature, and this is a breakdown of the number of studies published on the topic of pain and tobacco smoking over the course of the years. And you can see that there's been an increased interest in this topic. So what I like to do is break down the directions of inquiry here into the effects of nicotine on pain and the effects of pain on nicotine. So in the first direction, we're talking about how nicotine can function as an analgesic, abstinence-induced hyperalgesia, and risk for developing chronic pain. In the other direction, we're looking at pain as a motivator of smoking, the use of nicotine and tobacco to cope with pain, and pain as a barrier to abstinence. And when you put these together, you get this reciprocal relationship in which the implication is the progression and maintenance of both conditions over time. So just a few notes on the co-occurrence of pain and smoking. Persons with chronic pain are more likely to report current smoking behavior. Current smokers are more likely to endorse pain. And 59 to 73% of current smokers endorse past month pain. Now that's across a number of different studies. So the prevalence of endorsement is quite high in this population. If we look at that a little bit differently, the prevalence of smoking among persons with pain, what you see in the first bar is the roughly 14% representative of smoking in the general population. If you look at chronic pain measured via surveys or national surveys, that number jumps into the range of about 30 to 42%. And then what you see in the final bar there, labeled clinical pain, this would be like treatment-seeking pain patients or samples that were derived from pain treatment centers. This is important to note that this is after accounting for a range of other factors and that similar rates have been observed in other countries. I think this really underscores the notion that smoking might be especially prominent among people with chronic pain, and that some of the recalcitrance that you see in inability to stop smoking may be representative of the pain population as an important subgroup. So the first thing to note is that there's significant covariation between pain and smoking. We observe all kinds of positive correlations across studies and samples between pain intensity and cigarette dependence, or pain intensity and physical impairment. So smokers tend to report more severe pain, and they also tend to have less functional ability in the context of chronic pain. They've also been shown to administer more analgesic medications or opioids than non-smokers, so they're more likely to use opioids, more likely to misuse opioids, or even in the context of post-surgery, self-administering more morphine than would non-smokers. So that's covariation, correlation. We like to think about this in terms of potential causal pathways. So in focusing on that first one that I introduced, the effects of nicotine and tobacco on pain, And really, this is some of the information that caught my attention early on, and that is smoking has been identified as a unique risk factor in the onset and progression of multiple chronic pain conditions. And I continue to try and update this literature as it goes. These are systematic reviews, meta-analyses. These are cutting across numerous studies. Chronic low back pain, rheumatoid arthritis, peripheral neuropathy. There's also recent work showing that pack years smoking, so total lifetime exposure to tobacco, is positively associated with the severity of pain, the persistence of pain. So that's the number of days, for example, in the last 180 days that you would experience pain on. And usually anything over half, so 90 out of 180 days is considered persistent. And an increased sensitivity to experimental pain induction. So this is just among smokers in general, and a linear function of the amount of tobacco consumed in their lifetime. As was pointed out earlier, there's been a number of studies that demonstrate acute analgesic effects, so that could have positive reinforcing qualities for sure. Negative reinforcement is critical in that process, in that you're alleviating a pain state or the negative affect associated with pain via smoking. So if we shift from there to the effects of pain on nicotine and tobacco use, that's really a much less studied topic and very relevant, I think, to addictive processes and the treatment of nicotine dependence. There is accumulating evidence that smokers readily endorse the use of tobacco to cope with pain. They report that, they endorse smoking-related expectancies and motives. So these are things that are really interesting to me in the human literature because they represent potential targets for treatment and things that can help maintain this behavior in the context of chronic pain. There's also evidence from interesting EMA studies that increased pain tends to precede smoking episodes. We've also done some experimental work showing causal effects of pain induction on motivation to smoke. So this is to kind of briefly go over this. This study used a cold presser, and participants were either in pain or no pain, so cold presser or not. And one thing that we looked at was their self-reported urge to smoke right after undergoing the pain stimulus. So what you see there is that people who were in the pain condition reported much higher urges to smoke. But that's a self-report measure. So another thing that we looked at was latency to smoke. So many of you may be familiar with this, but that would be considered the amount of time from given a cue that you're allowed to have a cigarette to when you go ahead and light and try to smoke that cigarette. So what you see here is the number in seconds of latency to smoke, and that the people in pain basically reached for and lit their cigarette faster than those in the no pain condition. That's consistent with their self-reported urge. And then what you see down here at the bottom is a follow-up study to that, where the idea was how can we potentially disrupt this pathway, this effect of pain on urge to smoke? So we did two things in a 2x2 design. One was to challenge the expectations that smoking in response to pain would be a good idea. And the other was to allow people to use a pain coping strategy. This was listening to and reading aloud letters for a distraction. So kind of internally valid, maybe less external application in terms of a coping strategy, but I think pretty decent for the hypothesis test. And what we showed was that both of these were similar in being able to disrupt this pathway. Both of them did it. There wasn't necessarily an additive or synergistic effect, but both kind of accomplished the goal of disruption. So there's other things that we see in terms of the effects of pain on tobacco, and that's, do people with pain experience more difficulty quitting? Do they anticipate more problems with quitting smoking? What are their perceptions of quitting, and how does that compare to people that don't have pain? So as you can see, again, I've tried to include a number of relevant citations here. Smokers with pain do tend to report lower confidence in their ability to quit. They identify a greater number of barriers to quitting, and they clearly hold more negative expectations for smoking abstinence. So they just feel like the whole experience is going to be worse, even if they're not really articulating that this has anything to do with my pain, right? This is just kind of cross-sectional examination, pain versus no pain. How do you perceive the quitting process? Getting into why that might be the case is kind of a different question, but this is the basics of it. And that brings us to pain and smoking cessation and what might be going on. So really wonderful experimental work done in the animal literature, totally setting up thoughts about this. So this idea that pain may increase during the early stages of a quit attempt, as demonstrated in the animal models, I think has tremendous implications for the large number of people with pain who are also smokers. What happens when they go about trying to quit? Why might they be anticipating having more problems? So we did an experimental study to kind of model what's been done in the animal studies. So what we did here is we randomized 165 daily smokers to either a nicotine deprivation or not, where they basically engaged in overnight abstinence or smoked as usual. And for this study, we used a capsaicin pain model. So we were able to apply capsaicin to the skin. This is not like the over-the-counter stuff that you get in the little tube. So this is stuff you get from a pharmaceutical company. You mix it up. It's about 10%. It's strong. It has more sensitivity to it. And it also allows you to assess things like flare. So that's the amount of flare on the skin. And we can measure that by putting transparencies over it, tracing it, and then calculating the area. So here's what we found in that study. What you see in the blue are those who were in the continued smoking condition, those in the orange in the nicotine deprivation condition, and what you see mapped out here at the bottom is these are the pain ratings at each 0, 5, 10 minutes, and so on, time points. And then what you see on the right is the area under the curve analyses. So that's just trying to get a composite of each of these spots here and compare them directly. So in this capsaicin pain paradigm, those who were deprived of nicotine reported greater sensitivity to that pain. They also evidenced a larger area of flare than those in the continued smoking condition. So this is important as you think back to Dr. Rose's presentation. We're implicating both central and peripheral mechanisms in these processes. So just one quick note on this. That is, again, kind of like the effects of pain on urge, demonstrating that, much like in the animal models, in humans, smoking abstinence may result in an increased sensitivity to pain. It's important to point out that these were not people with chronic pain conditions. In fact, they were purposefully excluded from this. So the questions of what happens to people's pain that's already present in the context of quitting kind of remains to be answered. It also raises the opportunity to, again, decide how might we intervene on this process, right? If it has a clinical implication that increased pain may precipitate relapse, what can be done about that? So we have a pilot trial going on right now, another 2x2 design, where we're using an acceptance-based strategy that's been shown to be effective in the treatment of pain, as well as the use of nicotine patch. And we're kind of crossing those to see, again, is there an additive benefit of that? Can we disrupt the effects of deprivation on pain sensitivity or hyperalgesia? So the main clinical implication being that smokers in pain may experience a variety of negative pain-related sequelae during the early stages of quitting. And of course, that could precipitate relapse, which may explain, in part, why so many people with chronic pain continue to smoke cigarettes. And then most recently, this one is currently under review. This is one of the first studies to take a big look at pain status as a predictor of smoking cessation milestones. So we did this in collaboration with partners at MUSC, and they were kind enough to include some of our pain measures in their work. So they did this prospective study of smoking cessation, and it had two samples. One was current smokers, those who reported an intention to quit in the next 30 days, and sample two, which was recent quitters, those who initiated a quit attempt in the past 5 weeks. And for this, we were able to get them to include a past 2-week pain item. So have you experienced pain in the past 2 weeks at baseline? And briefly, I'll go through some of the results. So what you see on the left is those who endorsed that past 2-week pain item at baseline and those who did not. So this is the percent of those who subsequently initiated a quit attempt, right? Remember, these were people who were strongly motivated to quit in the next 30 days. So you would think that the odds of engaging a quit attempt would be high across the group. And what we see is some difference as a function of that one item that was administered to them. And then on the right side, you see the number of weeks to the initiation of a quit attempt. And again, there they were a little slower in doing that. That same sample was followed for 2 months. And this is the point prevalence abstinence 7-day at 2-month follow-up. So again, this is the percent in the pain group, right around 16% reported being abstinent 2 months later, compared to 64% in the other group. Again, this is highly motivated people, so it's not surprising that there would be some high rate of abstinence at that time point, but fairly big differences. So let's move to the other sample. The other sample were the people who said, you know, I just quit recently, and then you want to follow and see kind of what happened to them. And what you see on the left there is the number of people who ended up relapsing at some point in that follow-up period. And that follow-up period is depicted right here, right? So they tracked them for about 8 weeks. And that was a pretty interesting result to us. So those in pain, 93% had reported a relapse at some point in that 8-week period, compared to only 4.8% in the no pain group. And again, you can see kind of the trajectory over time of that result. Let's look out a little further. This is 7-day PPA at 2-month follow-up for those groups. And again, some pretty big differences. In fact, the maintenance in this group was quite good. And again, very low in the pain group with some pretty high odds ratios. So I find this interesting. There are limitations to this study. I think that what it does call for is the need to better track the role of pain in these processes. I wouldn't leave here saying that this is the most important thing to account for, but what I do hope you leave here thinking is that this might be something worth assessing. There's a lot of variance to account for in cessation-related milestones, and if this one is contributing a fair amount, then I would suggest that it's perhaps worth assessing. And if you can get this with just one item, that's yes, no, think of what you can get with more granular assessments as well. So yeah, it's the first to show that co-occurring pain predicts these milestones. There's my variance point, and it underscores the utility of assessing pain among all smokers, as that might be an important construct or factor. Just a brief note on other emerging areas of research. So we have started to look at the role of pain in the use of e-cigarettes. Again, this is cross-sectional early work. Smokers with pain versus no pain have been shown to be 3 times more likely to endorse current e-cigarette use. In fact, in that same study, they were shown to endorse higher levels of all types of nicotine use. So it wasn't just limited to e-cigarettes, smokeless tobacco, hookah, you name it. If there's a source of nicotine out there, it seems that individuals with chronic pain are interested in finding it. This pain severity, this is across a couple of different studies, has been positively related to e-cigarette dependence, perceived risks of e-cigarettes, and perceived barriers to quitting e-cigarettes. So again, we're seeing some similarities in terms of how people are viewing their use of e-cigarettes or their ability to stop using e-cigarettes in the context of pain. So this brings us really to a lot of the things that I'm super interested in. I love the idea of building on the animal models, conducting human experimental models, testing for potential treatment targets, and then translating that work into human intervention trials. And we've done some of that. A recent meta-analysis or review of smoking cessation interventions among people with pain, so this isn't my quote, concluded that smoking cessation interventions should be adapted to address specific barriers and meet the needs of people with chronic pain. And I'd like to highlight a few things. In a lot of the presentations we've had, the focus is on the perception of pain, the amelioration of pain, or the experience of hyperalgesia. And I think in the context of chronic pain, it might not just be about the intensity or severity of the pain itself, right? Not the 0 to 10 pain rating. So that's important, and that's a reliable correlation that we've observed. But really, the persistence of the pain condition seems critically important. The degree of impairment, life impact, functional impact, physical functioning. I could have presented so many other things, but we've done some work using experimental models of smoking cessation. And what we found there was that pain-related impairment and impairment in functioning was actually the strongest predictor of any of these in predicting relapse in the context of that experimental smoking cessation model. Also critical here, I think, is the role of pain coping self-efficacy and the outcomes of the ability to cope with pain, right? So if you think about this as a causal model and someone experiences pain, if they have strong adaptive coping mechanisms, their need or reliance on nicotine to help them cope might be lower than someone who hasn't developed such adaptive coping processes. So again, these kind of cognitive affective processes, I think, are critical in both how we think about why is pain playing a role in smoking cessation, but also in how can we go about intervening on it. There's also important opioid interactions to consider. That's the effect of opioid use or tapering on substance use in general and smoking. So not all chronic pain patients are created equal, and they might be using different things, and those who are using opioids may experience different effects of nicotine, interactions with metabolism. What's the role of stopping using opioids or tapering? And is that a good idea in the context of smoking cessation, or vice versa? What does smoking cessation have potential effects on the utility of those opioid medications? So even there's different layers to unpack, some subcontext to be aware of. And as we get closer to the end here, I do want to highlight, even though I could have presented individual slides on each of these, what we're trying to focus in on are potential transdiagnostic factors. That is, things that have been implicated in both the chronic pain and tobacco and substance addiction literatures. As you know, some of these things are often siloed, so what we're trying to do is bridge those gaps. And one that I have highlighted there, again, I could talk about each of these, is pain-related anxiety. So that one's interesting because it's a little bit similar to catastrophizing in some ways, but it's this kind of exaggerated, anxious response to interoceptive stimuli, specific to the context of pain, so very relevant to those with chronically painful conditions. And I have some studies listed here, but there's more. We've shown pain-related anxiety independent of pain intensity or functional impairment to be predictive of smoking cessation outcomes or rates of smoking. So that's really important because we're already trying to treat pain, right? And treating pain or reducing pain may not be the answer to how to intervene in the context of these bidirectional pain-substance use relations. But if you can target something that potentially has benefit for both the substance use component and the pain component, then you might have a more efficient and efficacious intervention point. So we're currently have under review, for example, a study to target pain-related anxiety in the context of smoking cessation among people with chronic pain. Again, giving us a specific target, something to go after that might have benefit for both conditions. And that's kind of the goal of a lot of our thinking. But frankly, any of these, and I'm sure other ones you could think of, could play an important role in these processes and serve as useful intervention points. There's also a tremendous amount of comorbidity in the context of chronic pain and substance addiction and smoking. So anxiety and depression are very, very highly prevalent. So is PTSD, and frankly, other substance-related disorders. So the model that I presented to start with, this reciprocal model, is one that's focused on bidirectional relations between pain and the use of substances. And there are unique qualities to each of the substances, right? So we look at nicotine and tobacco, alcohol, cannabis, and opioids. And not all of those kind of function in the same way, or they might have different analgesic properties or different conditions in which they operate. But what this last point here is underscoring is the idea that while it makes good empirical sense to consider the role of pain in specific addictions like tobacco smoking, very likely there's also a high prevalence of alcohol use in those groups, right? So right now we have a separate study looking at bidirectional effects in pain and alcohol. And again, for the sake of internal validity, needing to account for the role of tobacco. But let's think about that a little bit differently. Polysubstance use is likely the norm in this group. And these transdiagnostic factors that I'm talking about theoretically have relevance across substances. So if we think about moving this field forward, and it's really still just emerging, right? It's still pretty new. Thinking about this as looking at nicotine and tobacco as a model for how to conceptualize these processes and potentially intervene on them, but also keeping in the back of our minds that that model should be extended to address other substances or polysubstance use in the context of these other comorbidities. That makes it challenging, but it also makes it very open for new investigation. So in many ways, we're just getting started. I've mentioned a few of these already. We're doing some of the integrated treatments. We're also focusing on personalized feedback interventions. You know, I'll note too, one of the things we find interesting in doing some of this work is that patients always say, no one has ever talked to me about the role of pain in my substance use. No one has ever even mentioned pain as it might relate to my smoking. And they go, yeah, I do smoke in response to pain all the time. Like, of course, it makes sense to everybody that people would do that. But it's not being utilized as a teachable moment or something in that context where pain is such a predominant experience for people that have chronic and persistent painful conditions. And take tobacco, for example. They know that smoking is not good for them, as most people do. But maybe this thing that they desperately want to relieve is one thing that moves them over, right? Moves them towards that motivation, to that resolution of I'm going to do something different behaviorally to help benefit my pain. So whether it's patients or providers, there's really not a lot of dialogue on these topics, and I think that people are interested in that dialogue, and it could ultimately help motivate them moving forward. So in conclusion, this translational transdisciplinary study does represent an emerging area of clinical and experimental research, and I put forth the notion that pain and tobacco use likely interact to influence their respective trajectories and outcomes. Again, thank you all, and I appreciate this opportunity to share this with you.
Thank you. And we do have some time for questions, and I'm going to go to Dave first.
Joe, very nice talk, and I was interested in, I had a lot of questions, but the one that kept hitting me, and you stated twice, was that this hyperalgesia that takes place during tobacco abstinence is short duration. And I was wondering what basis you're making that statement on. Is animal studies, human studies,
Right.
and
No,
how long?
That's a great question. So that's just trying to be very true to the research that's been done. That isn't to say that it would resolve quickly. In fact, if you think about pain, perhaps even as a withdrawal symptom itself, then how you conceptualize the process of withdrawal over time may apply in exactly the same way. All I'm saying is that the work that's been done to date has only looked at these very discrete time periods. So if I'm reflecting what's clear in the literature, that's as far as I can go, but that's not as far as I think it goes.
Thank you.
A question about the relation between, or the prevalence of pain in smokers. So do you think that that high prevalence is due to the fact that smoking itself is through inflammatory mechanisms or whatever else exacerbating pain, or is it that smokers, because of concomitant variables like socioeconomic status and the kinds of jobs that might be, say, more manual labor than others, might trigger more pain conditions, or have you looked at that at all?
Yeah, so it's hard to answer those questions, but I think that all of it is true. So on the one hand, you have evidence that smoking, particularly chronic smoking, is helping contribute to the onset of these conditions, right? So already you're going to have a group of people who are more likely to have chronic pain. You almost have to think about it as, what's the prevalence of pain among people who smoke, and what's the prevalence of smoking among people with pain? Because that may not be one-to-one inverse of each other. So on the one hand, you have smoking contributing to the onset of these conditions, and then on the other hand, I think you have much like you have other processes like cue condition processes, for example, that you have this relationship between analgesia and then offset and then withdrawal experiences that repeated cycles of that over time kind of reinforce the behavior that's occurring and making it harder to quit. Also, you could conceptualize this as a disparity population in that both smoking and chronic pain are more prevalent among a variety of understudied, underserved populations. So there's lots of ways to think about this, and I think they all kind of combine to create the prevalence rates that we're observing.
Joe, great talk and some challenging questions too you're asking, but maybe because you're a psychologist, but it seems to me that you're trying to avoid drugs, okay? But the question begs itself is because in animal models, varenicline reverses the hyperalgesia in animals in withdrawal. How about your patients? Are you looking into the status of treatment, smoking cessation treatment like varenicline or Zyban, and how does this impact the pain as a risk factor in withdrawal?
Right, that's our next two projects. It is a little bit surprising to me that given the agonist-antagonist properties of varenicline, for example, that's not been looked at in relation to pain. Neither has use of e-cigarettes. I think the question is, what is the target for this population? This goes back to some points that were raised in previous talk. Is it the combustion of tobacco smoke, or is it the nicotine itself, right? So if you can use nicotine products or agonist-antagonists in the context of early stages of smoking cessation, you might get better results, right? Help them get through that initial process. So in the pilot study that we're doing, not only are we giving them nicotine patches, but we're framing this, which I think is not commonly done, as an adjunctive treatment for their pain. So you're setting the expectation, even among people who might have tried patches before and didn't find it helpful or successful. We're not using it for that purpose per se. We're using this to ameliorate or help you cope with this expected spike in pain during the early stages. So to your point, all of that work needs to be done, which is why it's such an interesting area to me. And we're starting to make some inroads, but I think there's also ways to utilize interventions and medications that we already utilize for smoking cessation and reframe those and repackage them as something that'll be more meaningful to someone with a chronically painful condition.
Hi, I'm thinking about your talk made me think about the implications of the messaging that we send in treatment communities, recovery communities, for example, with alcoholism. Get your alcoholism under control before, and then when you're stable, we'll think about quitting smoking. Would your research recommend a change to that approach, or do you think that's still the right way to go?
It's interesting. So I mentioned that these different substances have slightly different nuance in the context of the pain experience. So for alcohol, for example, we conducted a review and a set of analyses based on other people's work, which showed that the greatest benefit in terms of pain intensity and impairment was observed among low to moderate drinkers, mostly low, right? And there was like this curve such that people who didn't drink at all had worse impairment and pain than people who drank a little bit, but both of them were better off than people who drank a lot. So I don't think there's any hard conclusions that one can draw, but since this field, I think, is just kind of in its earliest stages, I am advocating for that point of increasing intersection of those to see how are these operating in tandem. It's just hard, particularly when you're proposing studies or projects, to jump to that point before you have enough support for each of them kind of individually. But absolutely, I agree. I think you could make a number of interesting statements relative to alcohol, just like you would to cannabis and medical cannabis in these relations, and then how opioids intersect with all of that, because that's present either way. It's a very interesting topic. I hope that I at least partially answered something that you said, but I think mostly I'm raising questions. Yes?
Great presentation, really great novel ideas. I think this is fantastic. I just had a question about how you measured pain, or if you found consistencies in the areas of pain, or was it just a general pain? And then was it pain that was acute to that particular participant, or was this something that was ongoing? I was just curious on how that was kind of defined when you talked about pain.
Right. So in the context of the experimental studies that are done, that's more consistent with kind of acute experimental pain reactivity. So that could be sensitivity to pain, but these things vary across the pain modality that you're using. So in the context of like thermal pain, for example, that would be measured in degrees. In cold pressor, that would be measured in terms of seconds of tolerance. So you can infer things like tolerance and threshold across some of those, but they're somewhat different metrics. In the current studies that we're doing, we're trying to invoke some of the best work being done in experimental pain reactivity, like quantitative sensory testing. So we're looking at things that potentially provide more insight, like conditioned pain modulation and offset analgesia. And it would take some time to go over those, but these are highly clinically relevant quantitative sensory testing approaches that give you more insight into mechanisms of action. So on the experimental side, there are differences in how these things are assessed and can be interpreted, but there's also differences in terms of what they reveal as far as mechanisms go. On the non-experimental side, what we want to be attentive to is not just focusing on pain intensity per se, but degree of functional impairment or functional aspects of what their pain experience is like. So the persistence of it, the intensity of it, and even there, you have a tremendous amount of variability in terms of time frame. Are you talking about over the past 3 months? Or are you talking about over the past 24 hours? So some of those assessments should be tailored to the period of time that you're doing your other work in. So in an experimental study, for example, if we were following people who were quitting smoking, what I would say is you want to give like a measure that establishes the chronicity and persistence of their pain at baseline, and then you're tracking their pain intensity and impairment over briefer periods of time that correspond to the other things that you're already assessing, like withdrawal symptoms or use of medications. So you really have to tailor the time frames of what you're looking at to the particular study. All right, thank you.